All right, let's get started. This is the 13th lecture, the antepenultimate lecture for those of you who like words with Greek roots. And we are moving into a discussion of Dutch and German skepticism with a focus on the German side of that today, but also the way that German skepticism got brought over to England. You'll remember from the introductory lecture that we talked about a movement centered in Germany where the work of F.C. Baur started a school of thought at Tübingen. This school of thought was influenced from the beginning very heavily by Hegel as well as by Hume. And the Hegelian side of it sort of came to characterize these sort of explanations that were offered for early church history and the origins of Christianity in particular. Some of the works of authors of the Tübingen School were translated into English, but very notably, Walter Cassels published a work that popularized this kind of critical scholarship, making heavy use of a wide range of German literature, but particularly Tübingen scholars, as we will see. That position was later challenged and driven back, but we'll talk about it briefly. And since I know that you've already read the Bruce article, I won't feel the need to repeat too much of what I said there. Ferdinand Christian Baur, the founder of the Tübingen School, was a German theologian, started out fairly conservative, but very rapidly moved into radical waters. His critical investigations of the canonical Gospels, published in 1847, a little more than a decade after Strauss, set the tone for the Tübingen School with regard to New Testament scholarship. Like so many other German scholars and skeptical scholars in general, Baur did not argue for the impossibility of miracles. He assumed their impossibility. For him, the question was not, might the miracle stories be true, but rather, since they obviously are not, what account can we give for the origin of Christianity? So that you don't think I'm putting words in his mouth, let me just quote from page 530 of that work. The main argument for the later date of our Gospels is, after all this, that they, one by one and still more collectively, exhibit so much out of the life of Jesus in a way which is impossible. If you look that up in context, he clearly means by that a way that is miraculous. So that's why we have to date the Gospels late, and date them late he did. The position that Baur took is that all of the Gospels arose in the 2nd century, and John late in the 2nd century, very late, well past the halfway mark, maybe as late as 170 or so. Well, you might wonder, how could such a view be responsibly advocated? After all, we do have works of church fathers in which they, from time to time, quote things that appear to come from our canonical Gospels. And the answer is this. What the early church fathers are quoting isn't the canonical Gospels. It's something else, maybe oral tradition, maybe some now lost gospel, which happens to look a lot like bits of Matthew and bits of Luke and bits of John, but not our 4 canonical Gospels. Why not? Well, this goes back to the Hegelian emphasis. A burning question, says Baur, and to some extent he has a point here, he just overstates it and then goes off in a very interesting direction with it. A burning question in the early church was this: did a Gentile need to become a Jew in order to become a Christian? And we can immediately think of some places where there was a conflict between Judaizing elements in the early church and the Pauline stance. So, for example, the 2nd chapter of Paul's epistle to the Galatians may come to mind. And Baur took the point of view that there are 4 works in the entire canon of 27 New Testament books, the authorship of which tradition has got right. And those 4 books are 4 of Paul's epistles, the first 4 as they appear in order in our New Testament: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. All four of those works show, either directly or in some echo or outline, the conflict between the Judaizing element who said Gentiles must become Jews to become Christians, and the Pauline faction which said no, they do not need to become Jews in order to become Christians. So Jesus, Baur maintained, had taught a universal religion, and Paul had caught correctly the spirit of that universal religion. However, James and other leaders in Jerusalem did not see that, and so there's a conflict that arises here, a thesis, Jesus' original teaching, and an antithesis, the Judaizing tendency of some of the early church leaders, which must be synthesized. Well, how was it synthesized? The synthesis took place in the 2nd century, and particularly in the writing of the book of Acts. So there are two aspects of the book of Acts that are of central importance in this question. One of them is the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, and other is the narrative of Peter's dream and his visit to Cornelius. In the story of Peter's dream and his visit to Cornelius, Peter is rebuked for thinking that Cornelius has to become a Jew like him and follow Jewish dietary laws in order to follow Christ. In the Jerusalem Council, very light burdens are laid upon the Gentiles, no burdens that would match the extensive set of requirements that the Jewish Pharisees would have laid upon themselves. Both of those accounts in the book of Acts are sheer fabrications, according to Baur. But they're fabrications with a tendency, a tendens. And that tendency is an attempt to smooth over the conflict, to create a new synthesis of a Christianity in which the warring factions can find peace with one another, which they much need in order to withstand the persecution that they're facing in the 2nd century. So everything is tendence, everything is tendency. The Gospels are tendentious accounts, giving us pictures from different perspectives of Jesus. They are 2nd century documents. They're not written by followers of Jesus. In all likelihood, they're not written by anyone who knew any followers of Jesus. Instead, they exhibit literary schools of thought that are attempting to come to terms with the oral history of Jesus and to cast it in their own terms and take sides in the great Hegelian conflict. All of it is underwritten, though, by this leading principle, that the Gospels exhibit so much out of the life of Jesus in a way which is impossible, and therefore we must set them aside. Baur's scholarship is an elaborate exercise in reading between the lines. In the eyes of his admirers, he was a genius at reading between the lines and could find the most subtle differences and tensions there. In the eyes of his critics, he was someone who would have been better off if he had read what was on the lines instead of what was between them, and much of what he reconstructed was a sheer fantasy, woven out of his Hegelian dream of the way history should go, the way that conflicts should develop and be resolved. One of Baur's followers who wrote very extensively was Hilgenfeld. He was a patristic scholar and theologian and taught at Jena. He has a work published in 1854 that has not been, so far as I know, translated into English, at least not during the Victorian era. The title runs roughly, "The Gospels According to Their Origin and Historical Significance." And in that, he takes Baur's position, reworks it, but it worries a little bit about the dating issues. The whole question of putting the Gospels into the 2nd century is a very difficult one. It's a hard position to maintain. And as scholarship went on, even most of the German scholars retreated step by step by step until, in the end, they put all of the Gospels back into the 1st century. A figure of some interest in this controversy is Samuel Davidson. He was an Irish biblical scholar, and he began his work in the 1840s as chair of biblical literature, criticism, and Oriental languages in Lancashire Independent College at Manchester. He was relatively conservative at that time. But in 1857, he had to resign his position because he had written a book on the Old Testament that went pretty far in a higher critical direction, and people at the college were no longer comfortable with his teaching there. When he lost his position at the college, he became very embittered and revised his introduction to the New Testament, completely changing over his views and taking on the views of the Tübingen school. And he would, to the end of his days, write caustic pieces reviewing anyone whose position on these issues was more conservative than his own. But the fellow that I want to focus on most here is somebody whose work was very widely read and highly praised in the British press. Walter Richard Cassels was not a theologian or a patristic scholar. He was a British businessman. He grew up as the son of a consular official in India and published the work Supernatural Religion, an inquiry into the reality of divine revelation, in 2 volumes in 1874. Like many British men of his time, he had a reasonable classics education, so he could read Latin and Greek, and he could read German. His work is very heavily dependent, as you'll see if you look through it, for references to these people, on the work of Baur and Hilgenfeld and Davidson. So there's very little that's original in it, but he tries to organize it and present his case very forcefully. And the bearing of all of this is quite interesting. He, like the others, takes an anti-supernatural position, but then he also tries to say, you could have seen anyway that the evidence wasn't very strong. So the whole idea that there's some kind of historical evidence for special divine action is cut off philosophically by a Humean kind of critique, and is cut off on the philological and scholarly front by the work of the Tübingen school. I know I sound like I'm beating one drum over and over, but it's necessary for us to realize just how long a shadow David Hume's critique of reported miracles had cast. So here's a long quotation from the 3rd volume in 1877 of Supernatural Religion, a 3rd volume that came out with some responses to critics. The belief that a dead man rose from the dead and appeared to several persons alive is at once disposed of upon abstract grounds. The alleged occurrence is contrary to universal experience, but on the other hand, the prevalence of defective observation, mistaken inference, self-deception, and credulity, any of which might lead to such belief, are only too well known to it. Is it necessary to define which peculiar form of error is present in every false belief before, with this immense preponderance of evidence against it, we finally reject it? We think not. Any explanation consistent with universal experience must be adopted, rather than a belief which is contradictory to it. You need only go back and glance over Hume's essay of miracles in his Philosophical Essays of 1748 to see the enormous dependence of Cassels here on Hume. Direct, probably, but also filtered through people like Strauss and Baur, who were saying much the same thing. Now, here's a curious point about this post-dating of the Gospels. Here's a quotation from Justin Martyr, First Apology 61, probably sometime around 140 to 150. For Christ also said, except ye be born again, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, that it is impossible for those who have once been born to enter into their mother's wombs is manifest to all. That looks like a loose quotation of John 3, verses 3 to 5, the famous visit of Nicodemus to Jesus by night. But there are some verbal differences, unless versus except, kingdom of heaven versus kingdom of God, etc. Cassels argues on the ground of the looseness of the verbal correspondence that it is not, and this is a very common mode of argument. If the quotation is not exact, then it didn't come from our canonical Gospels because, after all, if they had the canonical Gospel before them, they would have quoted the exact words. That's the argument. It's very important when someone makes an argument like this that we have a way of calibrating our expectations. Should we expect exact verbal correspondence in quotations of passages of Scripture? Now, a very interesting point in this regard is that if you look back through the early church fathers and look at their quotations of the Old Testament, their quotations of the Old Testament are generally loose, verbally similar, but not exact. The degree of looseness is, in fact, very similar to the looseness of Justin Martyr's quotation of John 3 here. Undoubtedly, they had those texts in written form, and so as an argument that they didn't have a written text of John, this is weak. But remember, Cassels, following Baur, places the Gospel of John late in the 2nd century, and it therefore didn't exist to be available to Justin Martyr for quoting. So he has to explain away this quotation. Cassels' position here was treated with contempt by scholars. So Ezra Abbott, not himself a terribly conservative scholar, nevertheless pointed out that Jeremy Taylor, the Puritan divine from the 17th century, quotes the same passage in John 3 9 times. But he never quotes it in the same words as the authorized version. Only 2 of his own quotations of the passage are the same as one another. The same passage is quoted in yet a different manner in the Book of Common Prayer. And Abbott has quite a hilarious little passage where he says clearly Taylor had several different versions of this story, and the authors of the prayer book had another one, and none of them was the authorized version. This is a bit of calibration. This is a cross-check. When people are quoting short passages, they frequently quote from memory. And in quotations from memory, we frequently paraphrase what we are recalling. So long as the sense isn't lost, we don't look for any further verbal exactness. Curiously, when the early church fathers quote long passages from the Old Testament, the degree of verbal exactness is higher than when they quote short ones. Probably the reason is that for at least some of them, they looked them up before quoting them because they were longer and would have presented something more difficult to remember, and they wanted to make sure that they were getting at least approximately the same words. So we find that short quotations are the ones most apt to have these trivial verbal changes made in them. There's a problem that the Tübingen school faced, and the one that Cassels tries to engage with head-on, and here's the problem. Justin Martyr had a pupil named Tatian, and sometime around 160, or perhaps a little bit after that, Tatian was said to have composed a harmony of the 4 Gospels, omitting the genealogies, but putting together pretty much all of the other material from our 4 canonical Gospels. But we didn't have the text of the diatessaron. The very name diatessaron means through the 4. Many scholars took this for a reference to the 4 canonical Gospels, but according to the Tübingen school, the 4th Gospel at least, and maybe some of the others, didn't exist at that time, so they could hardly have had the high status required to be canonized and then to be woven together in a harmony of the Gospels in one single continuous narrative. So clearly, that couldn't be the case. What must really be the case? Well, Tatian must have put together maybe the first 3 Gospels and the Gospel of the Hebrews, which we don't have, but which conveniently enough has all of the things that church fathers were quoting loosely, except in the Gospel of the Hebrews it's very exact. So that's a hypothetical document that might have been the fourth one, but in any event, it couldn't have been the Gospel of John. That would not be possible. Cassels is quite insistent on this point and does an elaborate analysis of all of the evidence for the existence of the diatessaron and to his satisfaction explains it all away. Here is a specimen of his reasoning. The singular fact that the earliest reference to Tatian's harmony is made a century and a half after its supposed composition, that no writer before the 5th century had seen the work itself, indeed that only 2 writers before that period mentioned it at all, receives its natural explanation in the conclusion that Tatian did not actually compose any harmony at all, but simply made use of the same gospel as his master Justin Martyr, namely the gospel according to the Hebrews, by which name his gospel had been called by those best informed. Notice the language here. It's very interesting. No writer before the 5th century had seen the work itself. Those are Cassels' exact words. What can he be referring to? He wants the reader to come away with the impression that nobody who ever wrote before the 5th century had seen the work. But that can't be what he is saying unless he has a complete collection of every single work ever written, and most of those works have been lost. Of the works that we know from catalogs to have been written in the 2nd century, 85% are lost to us. We have only 15%, 3 out of 20, of the works that we know were written in the 2nd century. So there may well have been people who wrote, but whose works have not come down to us. Cassels, however, repeatedly slides between so-and-so says nothing about this and so-and-so knows nothing about this. He repeatedly takes the failure of someone to say something as a failure to know anything about it, and so turns silence into ignorance and then draws inferences from that. Again, although Theodoret, writing in the 5th century, says in the usual arbitrary manner of early Christian writers that Tatian excised from his gospel the genealogies and certain passages found in the synoptics, he offers no proof of his assertion, and the utmost that can be received is that Tatian's gospel did not contain them. Did he omit them or merely use a gospel which never included them? The latter is the more probable conclusion. Again, from Cassels. And yet again, it is obvious that there is no evidence whatever connecting Tatian's gospel with those in our canon. We know so little about that last work, indeed, that as Dr. Donaldson, one of the translators of some works of the early church fathers, frankly admits, we should not be able to identify it even if it did come down to us unless it told us something reliable about itself. Well, that was 1874. In 1888, an Arabic translation of the Diatessaron was discovered, and it was published. And here are the opening lines. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God is the Word. This was in the beginning with God. Everything was by his hand, and without him not even one existing thing was made. In him was life, and the life is the light of men, and the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness apprehended it not. It does not take any very great acquaintance with the Gospel of John to recognize the first few verses of the prologue. And Walter Cassels and those of his line of thought had considerable egg on their face. So the discovery of the Diatessaron in 1888, or the rediscovery actually, it had been found earlier, but nobody recognized quite what it was a grave blow to Cassels and to the Tübingen dating, because what this tells us is that unquestionably Tatian was using our 4 canonical Gospels, and in fact, just as the later fathers had said, Tatian omits the genealogies but includes most of what is found in all of the Gospels except for those parts. In fact, all except for some 50 verses or so. have a piece that corresponds to something in the Diatessaron. And that means that his master, Justin Martyr, when he speaks of the memoirs of the apostles and the companions of the apostles, which were read in all of the churches, is almost certainly referring to our 4 canonical Gospels. And he says that they are read everywhere where the Christian church is, and his experience stretches back nearly to the beginning of the 2nd century. So by the beginning of the 2nd century, those 4 and only those 4 were widely used. And with the discovery of the Diatessaron, it was no longer possible to dismiss the idea that these were really our canonical Gospels. But that they existed doesn't mean that they were true, right? So Cassels makes a great deal out of the argument from silence, particularly with respect to Eusebius, the church historian who lived early in the 4th century. His ecclesiastical history is a major source of information, but Cassels tries to make use of its silences as positive arguments. Here's Cassels. It is very important, however, that the silence of early writers should receive as much attention as any supposed allusions to the Gospels. When such writers, quoting largely from the Old Testament and other sources, deal with subjects which would naturally be assisted by reference to our Gospels, and still more so by quoting such works as authoritative, and yet we find that not only do they not show any knowledge of these Gospels, but actually quote passages from unknown sources or sayings of Jesus derived from tradition, the inference must be that our Gospels were either unknown or not recognized as works of any authority at the time. That's from Volume 1 of Supernatural Religion, page 212. So, we are going to subjectively determine whether a quotation from the Gospels would suit the purposes of one of these patristic authors. And then we are going to subjectively determine that a certain rough correspondence between our canonical Gospels and a quotation means that it couldn't really be a quotation of our Gospels, or it would have been exact. And then we are going to interpret that failure to use exactly the words of our Gospel as evidence that the 4 Gospels were not known at the time, or at least not recognized as works of any authority. That form of argument, that argument from silence, is one of the principal methodological weapons of the destructive critics of the Tübingen school. And for that reason, it's useful, again, for us to try to calibrate our expectations. What should we expect? Can we get any kind of grip on this other than just flying by the seat of our pants? We can, and Joseph Barber Lightfoot is a scholar who brought this issue firmly to the front of the discussion. Lightfoot was the Bishop of Durham and a prominent English theologian in his time, and indeed, perhaps for all time. He was the world's leading authority on the epistles of Ignatius. Ignatius was a church father who early in the 2nd century wrote some epistles to various churches as he was on his way to Rome to be killed. And these have come down to us in various manuscript traditions. Lightfoot argued for the authenticity of a certain version of each of these 7 epistles, and did so with masterful scholarship. He answered Cassels' book in a series of essays in the Contemporary Review, and it was subsequently republished as essays on the work entitled Supernatural Religion. And I believe that we have that in the database. Right, John? Great. Excellent. Here's what Cassels has to say. He talks about all the literature that we've lost, how we would have loved to have Justin Martyr's work against Marcion, but it's been lost. It's one of that body of work that's lost to us from the 2nd century, the 17 out of 20 that we know existed but don't have. And he says, in the absence of all this valuable literature, the notices in Eusebius assume the utmost importance. And it is of primary moment to the correctness of our result that we should rightly interpret his language. Above all, it is incumbent on us not to assume that his silence means exactly what we wish it to mean. Eusebius made it his business to record notices throwing light on the history of the canon. The first care of the critic, therefore, should be to inquire with what aims and under what limitations he executed this portion of his work. This quotation comes from a portion near the beginning of his essay called The Silence of Eusebius. And he argues masterfully that Cassels has vastly overrated the silence of Eusebius through mistaking Eusebius' intentions. It was not Eusebius' intention to collect every reference to a canonical work. It was not Eusebius' intention to talk about the authorship of every canonical work with quotations from the earliest sources. It was his intention to talk about the history of the canon, but not to give that kind of account that Cassels wants to say he's giving. Let's calibrate with some examples of silence in secular history. This is a list that I've culled in my own work, but I think it's very much in the spirit of Lightfoot. Marco Polo traveled across China and wrote a vast work on it, but in that work he fails to mention the Great Wall of China. Can you imagine what his friends said? Think, Marco, did you see something 15 feet high, 20 feet wide, hundreds of miles long? No mention of it at all. No mention of foot binding, though we know that that was practiced. No mention of tea, though he traveled through the tea districts in China. Well, how do we explain that? Maybe, did he make up his story of travels through China? No. But he probably spent his time traveling largely in the company of foreigners, and things that we now can't imagine missing, he passed over in favor of other things that he was taking notice of. Ulysses Grant, who was a general during the Civil War, has 2 volumes of memoirs, meticulous, almost day by day, dated memoirs. He makes no mention of the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an event of military significance. It played a role in preventing England from coming into the Civil War on the side of the South. Doesn't mention it. Should he have mentioned it? Well, we can't imagine missing that now, but he passes through that time period without a whisper about it. The works of Thucydides appear so far as what we have in remaining writings to have gone unremarked by Xenophon and Aristotle. The first mention that we now possess is from Polybius. That's more than 2.5 centuries after they were written. Does that mean Thucydides did not write them? No. It just means that the remains of antiquity are rather sparse. The archives of Barcelona make no mention of the triumphal entry of Columbus. Those of Portugal make no mention of the travels of Amerigo Vespucci. Pliny the Younger, who gives a vivid description of the Mount Vesuvius, the volcanic eruption that killed his uncle in the year 79, makes no mention of the destruction of Herculaneum and Pompeii. The Roman historian Suetonius also mentions the eruption, doesn't mention that these 2 towns were buried. But they were, and we know they were because we found them and we've excavated them. Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare were contemporaries. They had large literary output. Neither man mentions the other. Some conspiracy theorists take this as grounds for saying that Francis Bacon actually wrote the plays of Shakespeare. That would be funny if it weren't so sad. The same thing is true of Jeremy Taylor and John Milton. Neither Herodotus nor Thucydides nor any of their contemporaries mentions Rome, though by the 5th century BC, Rome was a flourishing city and had a treaty with Carthage across the Mediterranean at that narrowest point. Their eyes were turned elsewhere. They just don't mention it. Josephus brings up this point about Herodotus and Thucydides. I could go on with examples like this for quite a long time. The point of them is simply to help us to calibrate our expectations when we see silence in an author, when an author fails to mention something we can't imagine leaving out. There are many reasons to leave something out. There are not so many reasons to put it in. If you put it in, either you think it happened, or you are deliberately trying to deceive your readers because you don't think it happened and you're saying it did anyway. If you leave it out, maybe you mentioned it in a previous work, which we have now lost. If you leave it out, then maybe it just didn't seem as important to you as it does here all these centuries later to us. If you left it out, maybe it was embarrassing for reasons that we might conjecture at, or reasons that we can't conjecture at. Eusebius writes a history of the Emperor Constantine, but omits all mention of the fact that Constantine had his wife and one of his sons killed. Why did he leave it out? Well, there we can say, okay, we get that. That was embarrassing. But what might have been embarrassing to another writer that we don't know about? We can't presume. Many things are omitted by historical writers. The argument from silence, the argumentum ex silentio, is the most treacherous of all methodological principles. I want to give you an example of one of Cassels' footnotes so that you have some sense of how his work seemed to people at the time. So just stare in blank wonder at the stupendous detail, all of the abbreviations and references to Lampe and Lardner and Beausobre and Mosheim and Ernesti and Weissman and Heumann and Schreck and da-da-da-da-da. The eye boggles. This is one of his footnotes with respect to the Ignatian epistles. The book is full of material like this. And this is one of the reasons that it was considered to be such an enormously important piece of work and such a scholarly piece of work in the press. So in 1874, when it came out, people rushed to write articles praising the massive scholarship of this anonymous author. In fact, it was rumored that it had been authored by a particular bishop, which of course it had not, and the bishop indignantly retorted that he had had nothing to do with the work and would not have, but there it is. So you can see what an impression would be made by a work in which this is only one of hundreds of footnotes. It's an impression of just massive scholarship, irresistible. It's Cassels' misfortune that he dumps a bunch of these footnotes into his book on the subject of the Ignatian epistles. So in his essays on the work entitled Supernatural Religion, Lightfoot takes this footnote apart. And here's what he says. This is doubtless one of those exhibitions of learning which have made such a deep impression on the reviewers. Certainly, as it stands, this note suggests a thorough acquaintance with all the bypaths of the Ignatian literature and seems to represent the gleanings of many years' reading. It is important to observe, however, that every one of these references, except those which I have included in brackets, is given in the appendix to Cureton's Vindici Ignatii, where the passages are quoted in full. In other words, it would take about 10 minutes for Cassels to have transcribed 2/3 of his references simply by rummaging through Cureton. Moreover, several of the writers mentioned in this note express opinions directly opposed to that for which they are quoted. Walton, for instance, defends the genuineness of the Vossian epistles very decidedly and at some length against Whiston, whose Arianism led him to prefer the long recension. Weissman declares that the authenticity and genuineness of the epistles had been demonstrated clearly and solidly by Pearson and others, so that no valid objections remain affecting the main question. Thiersch, again, who wrote after the publication of Cureton's work, uses the 3 Syriac epistles as genuine, his only doubt being whether he ought not to accept the Vossian epistles and regard the Curetonian as excerpts. Of the rest, a considerable number, as for instance Lardner, Beausobre, Schreck, Griesbach, Kestner, Neander, and Baumgartner Orosius, with different degrees of certainty or uncertainty, pronounce themselves in favor of a genuine nucleus. In other words, Cassels was bluffing. I am sorry to have delayed my readers with an investigation which, if I may venture to adopt a phrase for which I am not myself responsible, scarcely rises above the correction of an exercise. But these notes form a very appreciable and imposing part of the work, and their effect on its reception has been far from inconsiderable, as the language of the reviewers will show. It was therefore important to take a sample and test its value. I trust that I may be spared the necessity of a future investigation of the same kind. If it has wearied my readers, it has necessarily been tenfold more irksome to myself. Ordinary errors, such as must occur in any writer, might well have been passed over, but the character of the notes in supernatural religion is quite unique, so far as my experience goes, in works of any critical pretensions. Ouch. There's some further resources that John can tell you if they're located in our library yet. If they are not, the links here in the slides are hyperlinks, and they will all work for you. George Park Fisher is writing before Cassels and deals directly with Baur. Kennedy is a brief work. If you omit the publisher's catalog at the back, it's less than 100 pages, that was published almost immediately on the heels of Cassels' book. Sadler's Lost Gospel and its contents is a critique of the idea that there was this one lost gospel that everybody was quoting exactly, and now we have no record of it. Sanday, The Gospels in the Second Century, is a direct critique of the idea that the Gospels originated in the second century, and a very learned critique. Hempel's Diatessaron of Tatian is a translation with commentary of the Diatessaron, and Westcott's General Survey of the History of the Canon of the New Testament in the 7th edition has a preface that is a critique, among other things, of Cassels, who had been very dismissive of Westcott himself. And so from pages 13 to 42, you have a discussion of Cassels directly there, and I think it's pretty masterful. If it were not for the fact that Lightfoot's book exists, Westcott might be the first place that I would direct you, but with Lightfoot's book out there, there's, that should be your first point of reference. That wraps up what we've got for today.